Hi, Jeff again. Another chapter on this book about understanding Americans. That's what I'm calling it. I'm calling it understanding American and understanding and working with Americans. I think that's the new title I finally decided on. Yeah, this is evolving as I go because I'm thinking of what would sound cool. This chapter is actually, I think, probably the most. I'll call it the most innovative part of the thing that I've thought about for years. The rest of it's kind of common sense, but this chapter actually digs into something that everyone I've talked to has just said we hadn't thought about that yet and hadn't seen that. And this goes back to history, just because I loved history in high school and in college and university, and my master's thesis kind of on some historical things anyway, socio-historical and linguistic things of in the Caribbean, but the thing that I've because I loved American history and studying that when I was in eighth grade and 11th grade and took the advanced placement, I read all the chap. I mean, advanced placement, we had to read everything. I mean, they made us do an hour of reading per day for 7 days a week for the entire year. And my professors, when I met with them 30 years later, he says, "You actually did all the reading, Jeff." He said, "You were probably the only one doing it, all the required reading." But the the thing with the as I think back in the colonies and the establishment of all the U.S. the colonies and what became the United States afterwards. Okay, think of the waves of the people that came. Think about Jamestown at 1607, 1609. I can't remember the exact date here. Give me a break for a year or two. I'm not looking up the dates again right now. The dates I don't remember exactly. They'll be pretty close. Jamestown was more or less economic. You know, people came for economic reasons. They left their home countries or countries, um, and not all of them were for England. Okay, so it's very important to understand not everybody came from England. You know, there were different people were coming from different places too, and from actually picking up other people and that. It wasn't so. It just wasn't one single group of people come from one place. Okay, or one country. 1607 more economic. If you think about Plymouth, you know, with the three boats that arrived, with those that actually survived the trip and they got there. And if you really look into the history of what happened and where they landed and where they thought they were going to land and all that, and the first year was really a difficult year. I mean, really difficult. It wasn't, the Thanksgiving story you tell in Cub Scouts, okay? It wasn't that. It wasn't that. They were starving to death. I mean, if you really study it, if you really look into what happened, um, it was a really difficult year, and the Indians saved them. Okay, the Indians saved them because they didn't know how to actually cultivate the land. See, they came from other countries where the cultivation, during the agriculture was way easier to do. Okay, but that's not what I want to get into. But I want to see just that we had different groups of people coming at different places, um, in different. Merci. Sorry, I got somebody just delivered something for me to eat, so I'm not worried about it right now. But um, um, the the people that came, and then even actually you got the French that actually arrived in Canada. I mean, so you get some of the French Huguenots came there, and you get those that arrived in kind of the Philadelphia area, which were others. And then you got some that arrived down, the southern states, where if I recall, I mean, Georgia was a penitentiary. It became kind of the place where they put all the criminals. Um, Actually, if you think of it, Australia, the same thing happened in Australia. They actually sent all the criminals off to Australia, in some places. So, but as I begin to think, Australia is kind of one case. If you do it, set it up, and you send them all in one place, it's one thing. But the interesting thing about the colonies in the U.S., or what has become the U.S., is that all of these different colonies were people that were fleeing their homelands for different reasons. Um, and they were the rebels. They were actually the exiles. They were the people that people didn't want. You got to think about it. It's not necessarily that they didn't want to stay. It's also that other people didn't want them anymore. Okay, I wanted you to really think about this. So you've got all of these, these different colonies along the coast that are being established. Now, it's a little bit different when you got adventurers. I mean, you get the whole Christopher Columbus thing, but he wasn't exactly probably the most, he was a pretty adventurous person, but he probably wasn't the easy guy to deal with too if you watch the Christopher Columbus movies. So, um, of course, there's lot of historical digging to do into this, but his was more of an adventure. It was kind of it was kind of a trip. It was research. They were doing research. Who would get to travel and figure out if there's anything on the other side of that ocean. So it's more of kind of a research, fundamental research thing, if you want to call it that. Um, but all the rest of them were sent as exile. They were exiles. They were in political exile. Um, it's kind of like as if you've got people today that would flee from their countries under political asylum. Okay, if you really think about it. Except the Indians didn't have an established, they didn't have this official thing saying you're coming in as immigrants. Okay, so that didn't exist. But that's how we see it today, and they'd be evaluated and say, we want you? That kind of thing. Um, if it was today, if all the colonies were set up today, and they would be evaluated. They would be evaluated on their track record, their police records, right, that kind of stuff. Today, you have to come in and say what's your police record, what's your criminal record, what's all that kind of stuff. And if they were all flagged, actually in their home countries, with the authorities as being troublemakers, they probably wouldn't actually get into them. They actually wouldn't be able to stay if you really think about it. Um, Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But I think the important thing here is to look at is all of these colonies, all these different settlements that became colonies were composed of rebels. And what happens when you've got and you got to think it's a group of people in the boat that actually survived. It was the survival of the fittest in the boat, okay? Going through all we all know that the boat trips were difficult. The slave this here they were not chained to the actual, boat. I mean, we see these movies and kind of get this idea that the slaves are chained to the boat. Maybe they were, you know, but here these were people that were just getting away. But all the people wanted to get out. They wanted to get out for some reason, usually political, or religious or economic reasons, and they all wanted to get out. It's not one person wants to get out and the rest. No, they all wanted to get out for some reason. They wanted to flee their. Okay, I'm kind of trying to build this up because I think this is a really important thing to understand American culture. And what happens when so you get all these different colonies, right? They became colonies. So that means you have all these people that are having kids. And what do parents do to the kids? They transfer things to kids about, the homeland and how they hated it, and they hated the king, they hated the kings or the queens, because back then that's what it was, right? And what you've got is all of these colonies had that same thing, and they had the same thing, in they had the exact same thing in common. And what then is, but they all decided during I mean, the differences between them, the folks in the north were, well, up in Plymouth were more religious, right? They were the Pilgrims, they're the Puritans. They're the Puritans. The folks in Philadelphia were more, they had money. Um, Folks in the deep south didn't as much, but they grew, they were growing cotton and other things. And they were all trying to survive economically, right? They're trying to kind of figure this land out that they didn't know, and how to cultivate the land and to make it and turn into something. And I mean, I visited Jamestown. I remember going through just I loved it because you just learn the history. You actually see it. And you're watching. You go asking questions in the museums and stuff, and you're trying to all the stuff you read in the books. You begin to kind of piece it together. It's really cool. But as began to think about this, I thought, what happens when you put each colony is a group of rebels that has children, and they're telling them about how they were rebels, and you got all these groups of rebels, and then you group them all together, and they're all fighting against. You finally get them all to fight against the same king. You get them all to actually be unanimous, fighting against the king, whereas they all didn't quite agree. But they all agreed that they didn't want to pick. See, they all didn't agree. All did not agree about the having slaves or not. I mean, that came out later. That whole thing, if you think about it, actually came out about 60 to 80 years later. That whole problem blew up. The whole thing of having slaves or not, right? But the early founders and the early, colonists had slaves. Um, well, some did, some didn't, some didn't. Some didn't have money to have slaves. Some did. They didn't care about it. But all those colonies actually, they were in consensus about being against the king of England. And what happened? So they all have this revolution. Okay, they all decide to group together and fight against the king of England. Okay, because none of them came from England, so there's that too. You got a lot of you got and all think of all the Pennsylvania Dutchess, but they actually came a little bit later. Um, there a lot of the Germans and the Dutch came a bit later. Because I know from if you even think about there were lots of there were waves of this, but the earlier settlers. I mean, we got to think about the earlier settlers, and a lot of this was happening too. I think I look at the Caribbean because in the Caribbean there was a lot of colonization, but that was more for it was actually in the 1630s to 40s, 1630s, 60s, 40s. So it was a little bit later. Well, a little bit later than the original colonies in what is now the U.S. But the 1630s, 1640s, there were a lot of begin to get to the islands and then begin to decide to turn them into um, you know use the natural resources and turn them into slave colonies that would be able to provide more agricultural type of the food industry. It's the food and drink industry if you think about it. And what are those I call what are those what are now independent countries or even overseas states of France? All of them are today are they survive on bananas and rum and fruits and sugar cane and um, those are the natural resources that they provide back today. I mean, we're centuries later, but that's actually that's what they're set up to do, and that's what the slaves are set up to actually work on the farms, okay, or whatever you want to call these things. That's what they were. And so this is the kind of thing that you think, what what happens when you bring all these people together, and then you have them all have a revolution against the same king, and they're all talking, they're all doing this, and they're all fighting the same cause, and then they're transferring this information to the children, and the children are growing up in this situation, right? And the children talking to their children. We all know this. I mean, I'm careful about anachronism. Anachronism that you think that always in the past, things in the past were always as they are today. Okay, Lucien Febvre in his I actually can pull the quote from the book here because I've got it. Lucien Lefebvre, 1977 or 1979, Harvard University Press. His book is called Life in Renaissance France. It's actually a translation from his it's actually a translation of his original book in French, which was then translated into English. And the preface of the book by the translator, which I cannot remember her name. I'm sorry, I don't have it here on the. I didn't write it down, but you can find it. It's a purple covered book. Okay, and on the in the preface that was actually written by the translator. Okay, I can't remember her name, so I'm sorry, but it's on the book when you go look up. But the original, the original French version was by Lucien Febvre. The on page 14, but page 14 X1V, that is Roman numerals, not Arabic numerals. Okay, it says that anachronism is the greatest enemy of the historian, who must always fight against the tendency to assume that things then were as things are now. And be it a matter of prices or horses, feelings or ideas. Sorry, it's hard to read this. That's something at hundreds years distance. I'm sorry, it's hard to read this here because it's on a phone. No, this is no. At 400 years distance in societies such as ours, things which continue to be designated by the same word are never the same. To be able to dare to compare them, one must first know them and evaluate them by themselves, if one can. This attitude demands the use of the techniques of many disciplines, which the historian will use to try to answer the questions posed by the past. Literature and cultural manifestations, unwritten as well as written sources, are as much the providence, it looks like, the province of the historian as our archives or memoirs. New questions are suggested by this approach to history. The need to arises for history feelings of how people in a given time think, how their minds work. And what Febvre was good about was helping break this anachronism thing. Sorry, I'm reading on a phone, so it's got it pretty small here. But what we got to be careful of is not to assume that things back then are now. But in this case, we can actually use history to actually figure out what happened, right? Let's look at examples like Germany, where we are still haunted 4 generations later after Hitler. The Germans are still haunted by how people perceive them because of Hitler, right? And so people don't trust the Germans. They don't. It's this constant mistrust, right? And the Germans themselves are constantly creating a self-prophecy of regenerating the same kind of attitudes of dominance. And so this creates a vicious cycle, right? But we see this 4 generations later, and we're seeing it changing. I mean, I'm talking to the Germans. I'm talking to this a lot. I'm talking to the Germans a lot and kind of figured this out. And to compare and say what, it's taken 4 generations to begin to try to deal with this, to get rid of this perception of what the Germans are, of them and the countries around them. Because I've lived in France for 30 years. I know what all the French think about the Germans. I mean, at work, at friends and family, I know, this is, it's the same theme all the time. So if we take that same principle, that if parents transfer this to their children, if they're constantly constantly, transferring this type of perception of people and things from generation to generation of who the neighbors are, the same thing was being done back then, where the parents are transferring the things generation to generation about where they had come from, right? And how they didn't like it. We all do this. But when a whole community does this, I mean, when it's different when you have like one parent or 2 different parents that come to different places and they're saying things to their kids. That's one thing. But when you have a whole community that all came from the same place and they're all complaining about the same thing, this is a recipe for rebellion, right? A recipe for it. And on top of it, it's not just one community. There's a whole 13 colonies here, all in a recipe for rebellion. And guess what? 150 years later, after the 1609 and 1620 and all those kind of, times, um, we're in the 1770s, so we're 150 years later, and the rebellion hit, and it hit big time because they all they all rebelled. But I think what happened then, I mean, this is all conjecture. This is conjecture based on trying to study history and knowing it and thinking about this. That what happens now, and comparing what happens in other cultures and how we do this and life and seeing that and taking into consideration this anachronism kind of thing and watching how things develop in cultures and how people pass things on to the next generations. What happens? You have all these colonies all just being rebels against their previous homelands, and wanting to kind of find a new life and struggling how we gotten here, and they got through, and they survived the trip, and they survived the first years. That's pretty, they got to pretty, that's already pretty tough. You got to have they had really thick skin to have survived that, and have kids in the middle of that too. And all. You got to think about all this. This was not simple. Okay, so they were probably those that had the thickest skin, which were probably the biggest complainers, possibly, because passive people, kind of just like, they're not going to make it through this kind of thing, right? But the hardcore folks are going to do it. And the hardcore folks, so they're probably the hardest, okay? And so those are if you want to talk about Darwinism and the survival of the fittest here, the survival of the fittest, we're going to see that it can be those that are the toughest, and the toughest are not necessarily the nicest, right? Or those are the best, cool thoughts. The other folks that they want to drive because they want to survive. Want to survive. They want to get out of the stuff. They want to get away what they came out from. They want to get away from it. They wanted to flee that homelands thing. They wanted to get away so much that they wanted to survive that. So you get all these people together. Again, recipe for disaster. Recipe for revolution. Just clear revolution. They're all kind of sitting there at home, kind of living in they've been there for centuries. Their parents have been there for centuries, decades, and they're all kind of just living off the land of the thing. These folks had to go and just, go do the whole thing. And they had to deal with the Indians. And I'm not saying that the Indians were bad. I'm just saying it was another context to deal with. And the Indians probably didn't like them coming either. So that just caused certain lots of conflicts. Then you got to go and you got to deal with, you don't know how to speak the land to the Indians. You don't know how to do that. You don't know how to speak to the other people in the other lands. Well, there was enough understanding that there were European languages, that there were other languages. Because, kings were, kings and queens, and there was all intermarriages between them in action in Europe anyways. But that's pretty tough. But here is way different languages. Just we don't know what they are. Go and look at the whole thing of the 1492, the Christopher Columbus thing, and watch that movie. Again, movies are really helpful to see this because books tell you things, but the movies help you see it visually and see how they were dealing with the translation, how they wouldn't translate for some things he wanted to say and they didn't want to say it. That's the stuff they were running into. Okay, so this recipe for rebellion based on or recipe for well, it's a recipe for revolution based on rebels and rebellion. I think this is something that I've never seen it written, talked about yet. This is pretty innovative, I guess, is my idea, right? Maybe others have had it too. I hope so. But this would be something to go. It'd be interesting to go do a thesis on. I'm not going to go to another I'm not going to go do another thesis. I got other things to do. Okay, I really do. I don't need to write another one. That's why I'm doing the book here and letting other people kind of track it down. Just say you got it from me and then do something with it. But don't just say the date of the video and Jeff, and that's all, and that's fine. But I think this is a really and this explains this can explain after how many generations now. Now, how many generations? So let's say you could have 5 generations in 100 years, right? Because about 20 years each. And we are currently at 300 years. Let's see, I'm going to say here. We're at 400 years now. We're at 400 years from that. We're right now at 400 years from the earliest from the early settlements. Okay, 400 years. So 4 times 5. That's 20 generations. 20 generations of passing on stuff, and the whole industrial revolution, people came, and they had more, had more people coming from different places, and creating the whole, all the neighborhoods, and the whole, West Side Story kind of thing, and the movie The Jungle, by I can't remember these people's names. Darn, I feel stupid. Well, I remember the names of the books sometimes. Sometimes I remember the names of the authors, and sometimes I name and remember the books. Um, but this this whole situation that brought the melting pot that came and then brought up this whole, kind of the what has become the American people. And so, why Americans so different than others? Why are Americans considered to be so different? Why is their culture so different than the Europeans? The Canadians actually retained a bit because they still considered themselves under the king, or submitted to the queen. Okay, they still honor the queen, um, even on the money, and they, even as part of the Commonwealth, they have a reverence for they have a reverence for England, in the UK. But Americans don't. Americans just don't. They don't want anything. They don't like England. Okay, even now, 400 years later, still. Whereas, hey, we've already kind of worked at that piece, right? It's been 400 years. Come on. But there's still this thing of, we don't like your government. We don't like all you. And there's this kind of rebellious attitude which continues on. It really does. So 20 generations later, and and the Americans can be seen as different and actually rebellious. And then look at Trump and that kind of attitude, which other countries just don't get, right? They don't get. And there's this whole, like, well, we are the ones, right? We are the ones. We are the ones. We don't need other people, right? I mean, you see this in tourists. You see this in tourists. Watch tourists come who have never traveled, and they come, and they think they are the only ones in the world. Whereas, there are plenty of other people in the world, and they come and they think that they are the center. Um, Whereas they're not, but they think they are. The Americans do. Um, and this comes back to the chapter about being the best. We could see that they think that they're the only ones, the center of the universe too, on some things. Um, and then you get this whole rebellious attitude. Um, I'm not going to say anything more about it. I think it's something that you need to reflect on and to dig into a little bit more and think about. And I continue to think about it. That's why I did the book, did this chapter, this specific chapter, because I think this is a really important chapter of the whole book. Probably it's the one I think is the most important, or the least obvious. It's the least obvious, and it's the one that's worth. It's the one that's worth investigating. And I think I'm gonna try to reach out to some historians. In fact, I'm gonna reach out to my previous history teachers and ask them to kind of comment on this, and to begin thinking give their input on it, because I think this is really, how does this fit with how they've studied history? Um, it's worth considering and worth looking at, and worth doing some, those who have the time to do the research, that are kind of paid to do this regularly, and have the time to have the books, to have the access to the libraries and the things and all that, and have their own personal libraries that are filled with this kind of books and stuff. That's they're going to let them run with this one. I just don't. I don't have access to these kinds of things here. I'm not based in the U.S., and Paris is. I mean, it's too far away. I don't have access to those kind of things, and I can't have books sent over from the library. So no, it won't work. But I said, just, the history. buffs and history teachers and history majors, look at this, think about this. How does this fit into the rest of history? And why does it, can it partially explain, or can it partially explain where how Americans are today and how Americans function, how Americans, how they behave, how their attitudes are? Can it explain some of this, or maybe not? It's all up to you to look at it. But that's my contribution to this topic, which I think um, helps explain other things too that we're going to continue to look in these other chapters. But I think this one helps to really kind of begin to bring things together. At least as it's not the conclusion, but it's kind of a way to bring these things together and begin to analyze these as common points and how they all fit together. So we're going to finish up this chapter and go to another chapter, which I don't know what that is right now because this is all kind of agile. We're just going through and navigating through. I do these videos as I think of the topics, and I'll put them in a playlist afterwards in some kind of order. Okay, thanks so much.